Ever wondered how every Dead by Daylight killer got their weapon? What's the story, and is there any meaning? Let's explore this today. Trapper has two weapons, his primary cleaver but also his bear traps. Trapper got these in quite a simple way, he made them. Trapper grew up on his family estate, the Macmillan estate, which contained a mine but also an ironworks. Both of his weapons are noted to be self-made, crafted with use of the estate's materials, and hammered by his own hands. The cleaver in particular does look rather crudely made. The appearance of blood on both is likely from their usage, but also due to the ironworks lore making reference to the fact that Macmillan workers would frequently fall into the large cauldrons in the ironworks, meaning the cleaver and bear traps likely also contain, in part, the Macmillan workers, which is pretty grim. Wraith has his weapon, the AZHYMOVS axe. This weapon is particularly unique as it contains the skull of Wraith's former boss at Autohaven Wreckers, Azeroth. Azeroth was a truly awful man who not only deceived Wraith, lying to him for years by hiding people within the car crusher that he had been paid to disappear, Wraith unknowingly killing them in the process, simply thinking he was doing his job, but in reality aiding Azeroth's disappearing business. But he was also terrible beyond this, with the Blood Lodge lore entry inferring he may have first kept these people in his basement and done horrible things to them. As a result of the revelation of Azeroth's disappearing business and Wraith's unwilling involvement, he shoves Azeroth into the car crusher and tears out his skull and spine. Upon coming to the realm, he crafts it into the AZHYMOVS axe weapon. To make it a functional weapon, however, he seems to have incorporated some metal elements, likely scrap metal from the Autohaven Wreckers realm. It's highly theorized that Azeroth is actually alive still within the weapon, or his soul is contained within. After all, the entity is able to keep people alive and sentient within parts of themselves. This may be the case for Azeroth too, who has been sentenced to an eternity of being bashed against a cast iron bell. Billy has his brutal cattle hammer and debatably more so primary weapon and power, his chainsaw. Billy is another case of crafting his own weaponry. Whilst there's no direct mention or account of this, it can be inferred pretty easily. For one, due to the scrappy appearance of the weapons, which also match up to Billy's own look in many ways, but also due to the perk Tinkerer, which says, the hillbilly makes impressive tools out of scraps, tools aimed at maiming us in creative ways. This being from a survivor's notebook, presumably. We further have the flavor text of the toolbox, which makes reference to the tools inside potentially belonging to one of the killers before. This is more than likely Billy's. So Billy is an established tinkerer of cruel weaponry, meaning his two cruel looking weapons are probably made by his own hand. The cattle hammer is more than likely an adapted version of the one he originally used when slaughtering cattle for his parents, just adjusted now to his liking. Nurse simply has a bone saw. The story here is probably just that she took it from the asylum, specifically the operating theatre on the first floor, where we can see other bone saws. There were a number of patients within the asylum that had physical injuries, such as the broken woman, where they may have needed amputation of some kind, which is why there would be bone saws there at all. It's also possible, due to Nurse's lore aligning with that of World War I, that there may have been soldiers sent to the asylum during the war, needing medical aid. There's a few nurse outfits that sort of hint toward this. It is a slightly irregular weapon for Nurse, however, as she's noted to do most of her killing via injection in her tome lore, and seemingly with her bare hands based on her mori. So it's interesting she uses a bone saw. I imagine it's just for convenience though in the realm. Myers has a kitchen knife, and one that he simply first pulls out of his kitchen in his family home when killing his sister, and then out of a hardware store later on, 15 years later in 1978, when he goes on his massacre. There's no significance or importance to the blade really, and that's debatably the importance, is the lack of significance. Myers simply has an innate drive to kill, and so the simple utensil of a kitchen knife is all he requires. Hag's weapon is actually her hand, or forearm really, named Ashen Claws. It's a mutated part of her body that appears to have been reattached to her after the blood oath she made with the entity. As she was captured and slowly eaten away by her captors, it's quite likely her arm detached at one point. With use of the Hex or Entity magic though, she was able to reattach and bandage her arm, with it said to have horribly overgrown as a result of the magic. This results in the overgrown and claw-like hand which looks inhuman. The hand further became a catalyst for her Hex magic, specifically a blackened finger on this hand which acts as the catalyst for her powers. So it all originates from the oath she made with the entity, the connection she formed when calling out to it with her hexes. Doctor has his customized bat named the Stick. This is simply described to be a final tool used if all of his other treatments failed, these treatments largely being electroshock therapy experiments. Therefore the suggestion here is he would kill the person with this bat if all his experiments brought him nothing, a brutal look into Doctor. Huntress is equipped with a broadaxe but also her hunting hatchets. These are interesting weapons as it seems highly unlikely she would have made them herself, unlike many of the other early killers. After all, she was left alone in the Red Forest as a child after her mother's death. There's no feasible way she could have created this weaponry which appears to be made out of iron or steel. The greater likelihood and origin of almost all of her weapons, or things in general, is that she scavenged them from those she killed, as well as from nearby villages. The other possible origin is that it belonged to Anna's mother originally, as we do see her also wielding an axe during a flashback cutscene when Anna is a child, although it's more of a hatchet type of weapon. Therefore it's also possible they could have already belonged to the family, and had a hatchet store in the mother's dwelling cabin. The flavor text does mention that the broadaxe is suitable for chopping wood mainly, so that would make sense, as it's a log wood cabin. Bubba has the sledge and his signature Bubba's chainsaw. His chainsaw, as just an interesting fact, was actually a birthday gift from his family, so there is sort of a special or sentimental aspect to it, along with being considered a family member in its own right. The sledge appears to have been a cattle hammer that the sawyers used to stun their victims, much like you would when slaughtering cattle. Brutal tools but with simple origins. Freddy has his clawed glove as his weapon, a custom-made glove with 4 claws on each of the fingers, with the thumb remaining free. This glove also seemed to double up, however, for his job as a groundskeeper at the Badham preschool, being used to trim bushes. The original Freddy made his glove out of parts from the boiler room, and it's quite possible this Freddy, the remake one, did the same as well, which would obviously hold a bit more meaning behind the weapon. Pig has her hidden blade, which she uses for her basic attacks as well as her ambush attacks. This is simply a creation of John Kramer, the Jigsaw Killer, with him being the mastermind behind Pig's tools in the trials, including her reverse bear traps, which Amanda herself survived. The only adjustments she's noted to make is with things like the tampered timer. She tampers with various aspects of John's creations to rig them and make them slightly more unfair. Clown has his blade named Madame Butterfly, with even the flavor text calling it a butterfly knife, even though it isn't one. The origin of this knife isn't overly clear, however I think it's quite likely that the name Madame Butterfly holds meaning to Clown in some way. It's likely named after someone he knew or possibly killed. I've always thought Madame Butterfly could maybe be the name of the person the prized redhead's pinky finger belongs to. Madame Butterfly is also the name of an opera, and there's some, maybe some small connections and hints to support the pinky finger theory, I don't know, maybe. This blade is also interesting as it has a feather design within it, feathers being the first trophy type that Clown collected before moving on to fingers. Spirit wields her shattered katana. This is an interesting weapon as it's got some disputed origin and therefore quite an interesting story behind it. The likelihood is that this blade is the same one that Rin's father used to attack her, causing the cuts across her body, with it matching her own shattered appearance. The blade shattering as her father used it to strike his own kin, his wife and daughter, a common theme in Japanese folklore, a weapon shattering like this. This was one of 2 blades displayed in the shrine in the Yamaoka family estate, which also featured the blade of Kazan Yamaoka, the Oni. The blade's flavor text, however, muddies the waters as it reads that it shattered after spilling the blood of her kin, presumably her being Rin. This could mean that the blade didn't shatter when Rin was struck, but instead when she killed her father, if she ever did. There's lots of ifs here. It could also refer to the blade striking her mother too, though, I suppose. But this blade possibly could have shattered later on when Rin used it. Lots of possibilities here. I think the likelihood is that it is just the one her father had that killed her, and it's just worded a bit confusingly. Legion have a variety of weapons due to there being 4 different members. Frank and Julie both use the same hunting knife, however the original or base appearance of Joey uses the modern karambit, and Susie uses the wooden ruler stake. There's not much of a story to these aside them being a nod toward the Legion's scrappiness using whatever they can. The choice of a hunting knife could be down to their extensive study of police reports and stab wound reports, with them figuring out the most effective way to use their weapons, or the most effective to choose, which they landed on being a hunting knife, with a serrated edge I suppose. Susie's is sort of handcrafted, with it being a broken ruler taped together with compass needles, which shows off their young age still, with this being school equipment. She likely even made this during a maths class of some kind. It also sort of nods toward her being the intellectual one of the 4, I suppose too. Joey's karambit is a bit odd and potentially was imported somehow, as Joey's mentioned to be a show-off, so maybe he wanted to get a bit more of a flashy weapon. Or possibly it came from a store Joey worked at, or his parents. He comes off as the least willingly violent one, so it's a bit odd that he has the most tactical and unique of the blades. Plague doesn't necessarily have a weapon, but instead a profane censer, which he uses as a weapon. This censer was used throughout Adiris's life, but mainly for religious purposes during her time in the Maiden Guard, but also later on as the High Priestess of Babylon. It would be filled with various things to burn and create a scent within the temple, usually pleasant things. Whilst earlier into her life this may have been more innocent things like herbs or spices, it later became bone shavings and flesh used as an offering to her god, the entity. She still uses it now in the realm in a ritualistic manner too. Interestingly though, despite some cosmetics mentioning some of the horrid things the censer contained over the years, it now contains the sweet fragrances of the gardens Adiris used to attend. Maybe because she views the realm as a paradise and her god's realm, she has this scent now. It sort of makes you think, can the survivors smell this as they're being swung at? They get hit and they smell this like beautiful garden. That's gotta be a weird whiplash, right? The censer's visual design is also reminiscent of the entity itself and its claws, with the top part looking a bit clawy. Ghostface has a tactical knife. The origin of this weapon is actually that, well, he simply bought it. Likely soon after moving to Roseville, we can see him go to a supermarket and buy the knife along with a bunch of other killing equipment, finally killing the store assistant, Carl. So the origin is just that he bought it, likely for future use as well in his killings. He presumably did this so publicly in a store as well because he knew he'd be recorded in the process, and this was sort of a feature of his legend, leaving behind evidence to make himself a bigger threat, yet still managing to evade law enforcement. As a more meta reference, the blade is also very similar in appearance to the Scream Ghostfaces, so it's probably a hint toward that as well. Demogorgon has the barbarous claws, which are simply just the claws of a Demogorgon, so it's an anatomical thing. There is a small little nod toward the character of Barb here though, with them going with the adjective of barbarous to describe the claws. Not sure if that was intentional. The Demogorgon in Season 1 being responsible for the taking and eventual death of Barb, Nancy's friend. I think it's plausible they did that as a connection. I don't know, maybe not. Oni wields the Yamaoka blade, an ancestral blade of the Yamaokas passed down from one generation of samurai to the next, finally ending in Kazan's possession. It's largely important for this reason to him, as his family's samurai legacy is the guise that sends him on his dark pilgrimage. He wants to rid the world of imposter samurai, as he feels like it's his duty to preserve his legacy. It does appear to be different to the blade that Spirit is later killed with it being far longer and thicker. However, it's quite possible he did also wield that blade at some point too. The other weapon he uses is a kanabo, a weapon often associated with Onis in Japanese folklore, and likely why he retains this in the realm, and possibly why he gained the name to begin with whilst he was still in the real world, earning himself the name Oni Yamaoka. Deathslinger has his handcrafted Death to Bayshore, a brutal spear gun named after his old boss, Henry Bayshore. Bayshore was his boss when he worked at a railway company, inventing a railway spike gun for him, which he later stole the patent for and sold on. In a rage, Caleb used the gun to pin Bayshore to his desk, nearly killing him. When Caleb is later contracted to become a bounty hunter for Hellshire Penitentiary, he creates the Redeemer, or Death to Bayshore, a fully weaponized version of the railway spike gun, named after the man it first pierced, and who he aimed for it to finally pierce, I imagine, too. Pyramid Head has a great knife as his weapon, with it physically appearing to be an oversized kitchen knife. The origin of this weapon, I suppose, is simply James Sunderland, with him being Pyramid Head's creator. The size of it is likely meant to further accentuate Pyramid Head's role as a punisher to James, but also a dominating force. There's also some theories that it's one half of a pair of scissors, with James also wielding this knife, with it referencing the fact that Pyramid Head is a second side of James, or a part of him. Blight has the weapon Bone Buster. Despite the uniqueness of this weapon, we don't really have an origin for it or any sort of notable meaning. I do think it's meant to be somewhat physically representative of him, and the two sides of his life, the sophisticated side, with these sophisticated designs and intricacies within it, yet the twisted and busted look of the cane being a sharp contrast to this. Or more simply, it's just meant to be a reference to his prior, more sophisticated life that he no longer lives. It may also be a nod toward Blight's inspiration, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with him wielding a similar cane. Twins have the Blade of Marseille, a blade that was scrapped together by Charlotte at some point during their years of survival. We interestingly get a direct account from where she got it too, stealing it from a farmer and modifying it slightly by nailing a nail into the top, and seemingly creating some more serrated edges on the top and underside too. Its main point is meant to contrast the legend around her though. Tales warned of a demon with a shimmering blade, when in reality she had an old battered sickle from a farmer and was barely getting by. So I think it's mainly meant to be a sharp contrast between the fiction of her and the reality. Trickster has the polished head smasher and also his throwing blades. From context clues, we can assume these are simply custom-made accessories, not by Trickster himself, but likely some high-end designer who he contracted. After all, Trickster absolutely brought not only his throwing blades, but also his various bat weapons onto stage, using them as part of his act. Therefore, all his fancy weapons were likely just expensive custom pieces made to his liking. Nemesis has his raw fists and tentacle, two things that are simply part of his anatomy. The origin of them and the origin of Nemesis at all is sort of a mystery. Nemesis being a creation of Umbrella Europe, but there being a lot of mystery around his creation. His oversized fists and tentacle come from both the T-Virus but also the Nemesis Alpha parasite. Pinhead has a hook and chain which comes out of a portal. This just seems to be an innate Cenobite ability to summon chains from the labyrinth or hell. This is all he's really doing, is summoning a chain very quickly and flicking it against the survivors. The chains and binding is largely to do with the rather sexual origins or inspirations of the Cenobites and their designs, so that's the reason for these, I guess. Artist has the sharp palette blade, a blade she manifests from the stumps of her hands being cut off by the Black Veil in the Chilean graveyard that we see in the Area of Crows. As a result, and upon coming to the realm, the entity replaced her missing hands with ink, which can solidify and now forms into a weapon. Although still an art tool as well, with it being a palette blade, a blade used for art, and the primary tool that she used to paint murals back in the day, her main form of art, and reason for being targeted by the Black Veil to begin with, due to the large mural exposing them. So this has got to be quite a bittersweet thing, having a palette blade in place of her hands, a thing she used to use for beauty or her art, a way of expressing herself, now used for simple, brutal killing. Sadako has an interesting weapon named Ring of Fury. This weapon spawns in a Japanese character in a glowing energy of some kind, this being Sadako's Nensha power, which enables her to burn images into the tape, but also just into thin air if she pleases. In the realm, it simply directly damages when she does this too. I think it's the force behind her outstretched palm and the power she's using with her sort of psychic ability. The character itself also reads Curse. It's almost as if she's weaponizing the curse in a short burst to cause damage. Depending on the outfit she's wearing too, this character changes to read different things, which is quite interesting. Dredge has the knotted appendage. I think this is just a meat mass made up of likely a combination of many different people from the Garden of Joy. It's largely just fingers. Dredge seems to largely contain the members of Otto Stamper's community, the Garden of Joy, a community with the aim of keeping all dark thoughts away. After it all fell apart and darkness swept through it, Dredge appeared, absorbing the Ottomarians. They all got mixed up in there and had a brutal fight before, leading to the strange meat mass Dredge wields now. It's quite possible too you that it's formed into this shape as a result of forming around a tilling blade, another thing that Dredge probably consumed, as the shape of his appendage is similar to the tilling blade add-on. So it's not just like meat masses inside of Dredge, there's probably other things from the Garden of Joy too, inanimate objects and stuff like that. Wesker simply has a combat knife. I think this is just a STARS issued blade that he's held onto, as he used to be the captain of the RPD's STARS team. It may also simply be one he acquired later on during his solo days. I don't think it holds much significance beyond this. I think it's just a knife. He doesn't really need a weapon at all, so I think this is more just a placeholder for the realm. Knight has his imposing claymore, a blade that he crafted himself, learning the skills to forge such a blade at the Guardia Campania, a mercenary group who captured him and made him into a mercenary, with all of the training required. A claymore being a heavy and large two-handed blade. Tahos's is heavily damaged, melted seemingly, and simply bloody from usage, showing off his conquests. And also revealing the fact that he's probably used the same blade for the entirety of his life, or his life as a mercenary, I suppose. Skull Merchant has the razor-sharp dual blades. These were also created by herself, and we can even see where she probably made them on her map, with her workshop showing many prototypes and schematics. It's a blade propelled by a mechanical contraption affixed to her shoulder. It was inspired and originated from her father, and the character of the Skull Merchant, from his dark manga series, Son Hedora Sombrius. The character of the Skull Merchant as a whole being inspired by her father's image and writing, due to her great love of both him and his work, wanting to bring it to life. So all of these designs were conceptualized by him and brought to life by Adriana. Singularity has the Modular Claw, a deformed looking weapon that originates from his original form as a Huxley unit. He then altered it to his liking and his view as a perfect organism. However, we never see this, as Gabriel blows him to pieces and deforms him, leaving only this strange claw-like weapon which Hux awkwardly wields. The flavor text makes possible suggestion that it was never intended to be a part of the original design, but instead was quickly attached after the explosion as a means to kill Gabriel easier, as it says a sharp instrument attached to the arm, which would explain its awkward position and appearance. I think this was just a quick on-the-go fix to try and kill Gabriel with. Xenomorph has the lithe arm, and also its tail. Another case of it's just their anatomy. Xenos are brutal and effective organisms and killers, and its arm reflects that. Lithe meaning thin, supple, and graceful, so sort of a hint of beauty to this weapon of annihilation. Chucky has a chef's knife. Similar to Maya's, there's not really a meaning behind this or story, and Chucky doesn't necessarily have a signature weapon, I'd say. He uses a bunch throughout the film series. In his Mori we can see a number of different weapons he uses in fact, and so the knife is just another one of those. There's also even more in his add-ons too. Anything is a weapon to Chucky. I think that's more of what the story is behind this. Unknown has a fascinating weapon in the gently used axe. This likely isn't Unknown's go-to weapon or anything, but instead it's hinted at being a weapon that one of its victims used against it, but Unknown won that fight and took the weapon for itself. The person who wielded the axe may even be the default look person, as in whoever this person is that Unknown's wearing the skin of. The flavor text reinforces this too, with it making reference to victims' belongings disappearing alongside them. The axe itself is also quite clearly damaged, showing it was either broken in a struggle or by striking Unknown. It's quite possible Unknown did use this in other instances as well though, as we know of stories tied to or blamed on Unknown that happened in Greenville, where a killer was seen wielding an axe. There's actually a string of add-ons that reference a serial killer figure who used an axe and attacked a cabin, which may have been one of the many varied accounts of Unknown. So maybe it even sort of RP'd as a serial killer for a while. Interesting. Vecna has the Afterthought dagger, a dagger which is exactly how it sounds, an afterthought. Vecna is so highly powerful he doesn't really need a conventional weapon, but has chosen this one likely to appease the entity and its rules for the trials. From what I could find, it is also a weapon used by Vecna in real D&D though, and goes by Afterthought also. I do think it's meant to sort of double up with the meaning though, I could be wrong. Dracula has his pale claws, a set of retractable claws that seem innate to him as a vampire. It's just another anatomical weapon origin here. The story is he's a vampire, I suppose, so he has these claws. The flavor text also makes a reference to how effective they are. Houndmaster has her deadly cane, a cane she uses to command her dog Snug, but also is able to split in two, with the top half having a sword concealed within, which she takes out at the beginning of each trial. The flavor text makes reference to her desire for revenge, and so I think it's quite likely the skull in her weapon could be sort of representative of her desire to claim the skull of Molak, her arch nemesis, especially with the hands gripping it. It's not a real skull, obviously, because it's far too small, so probably more referential or representative, but also practical as a tool. Kaneki doesn't officially use a weapon of any kind, and I believe is the only killer to not have a weapon section of their cosmetics. In-game he uses his Kagane, however, to whip at the survivors. This is another anatomical weapon, a feature that many ghouls have. In Kaneki's case, his Kagane came out from his back and appears as tendrils, which he uses to strike but also move around incredibly quickly. He gets these after his experience with Jason, where his powers are sort of unleashed for the first time properly. Springtrap wields a pizza knife, but also a fire axe, which he throws. Both of these weapons, interestingly, don't seem to have any origin in the games, but instead from the FNAF film and the community. The pizza knife seems to originate from the movie version of Afton, who wields this same knife or a similar one, and even shares the same cleaning animation. The fire axe comes from the fans, and a specific song which featured Afton with an axe, which subsequently has become sort of canonized to some degree, and suggested to have been the tool that Afton used to previously destroy the animatronics. Krasue has a larba knife, a tie blade that's used for cutting meat. Interestingly, the lore doesn't mention, at least from what I can tell, that she actually used this knife to kill any of her victims, and she likely uses it in the realm in her human form for the sake of having a physical weapon to actually wield. When she killed prior to the realm, she did it whilst in her Krasue head form. It's possible though, maybe at some point she also wielded this larba blade to attack some victims or sort of preemptively get them into a bad spot for the Krasue to take over. Well, that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts as always down below. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.